She was pressed face down in the dirt behind the smokehouse with her stepfather's hand crushing the back of her neck and his breath hot against her ear telling her this was what daughters were made for. Violet Porter was 17 years old, and she had stopped screaming 3 months ago, because screaming only made Thaddeus Boone angrier, and when he got angry, he used his fists before he used anything else. The Texas sun burned overhead, and the cicadas screamed in the mesquite trees, like they were the only witnesses left who still had a voice. Most girls in Deaf Smith County in 1867 grew up knowing hard work and harder men, but what Violet knew went beyond hard. It went into a darkness that had no name in polite company, and no law that would touch it because Thaddeus Boone owned 300 acres and had friends in town who drank with him on Saturdays and called him a respectable widower who took in his dead wife's daughter out of Christian duty. They did not know what happened when the lamps went out and the door to Violet's room creaked open and heavy boots crossed the floor. They did not know because Violet had learned that telling the truth only got you called a liar and a whore. Her mother had died 2 winters back from fever, and within a month Thaddeus stopped pretending. He told Violet straight that she would take her mother's place in every way, and if she refused he would make sure she never saw another sunrise. He was a big man with hands like hammers and a voice that could crack stone, and Violet believed him because men like Thaddeus did not make idle threats. So she endured, and she survived, and she learned to disappear inside herself when he came for her. She would stare at the cracks in the ceiling and count them over and over until her mind went somewhere else entirely. Somewhere cold and empty where nothing could touch her. But 3 months ago something changed. Her body started changing in ways she could not hide, and Thaddeus noticed. He smiled when he saw it and told her she was finally going to be useful for something more than cooking and cleaning. He said a son would inherit his land and carry his name, and it did not matter who the mother was as long as the child was his. Violet felt her stomach turn and her heart crack, but she did not cry. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. She had cried herself empty the first few months after her mother died, and now there was nothing left inside her but a hard cold stone where her heart used to be. She tried to run once, got as far as the creek before he caught her and dragged her back by her hair. He beat her so badly she could not stand for 2 days, and when she finally did, he told her the next time she tried, he would tie her to the barn and let the hired hands have their turn. After that, Violet stopped planning escapes and started planning something darker. She thought about the rifle above the fireplace and whether she had the courage to use it. She thought about poison in his coffee and whether she could live with herself after. She thought about waiting until he was asleep and setting the house on fire with both of them inside. But every time she got close to acting, her hands would shake and her nerve would fail, and she would hate herself a little more for being a coward. The Boone Ranch sat at the edge of the Llano Estacado where the flat scrubland stretched forever and the sky pressed down like a lid on a pot. It was isolated country. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles south, and the nearest town was a full day's ride. Thaddeus liked it that way. He said a man could live how he wanted when no one was close enough to hear what happened behind closed doors. Violet knew that isolation was her prison. No one would come looking. No one would ask questions. She was as alone as a person could be and still be breathing. Sometimes she stood at the window and looked out at the endless nothing and wondered if this was all her life would ever be. There were 2 ranch hands who worked the property. One was an old Mexican named Esteban, who kept his head down and his mouth shut because he needed the work more than he needed a conscience. The other was a drifter named Carl, who had dead eyes and a mean streak, and who looked at Violet like she was something he might get a turn with if he waited long enough. Neither man would help her. She knew that. Esteban had seen the bruises on her arms and the way she flinched when Thaddeus came near, and he had simply looked away and gone back to mending fence. Carl had once cornered her by the barn and told her if she ever got tired of the old man she should come find him. She had run back to the house with her skin crawling and her stomach sick. One afternoon in late August, Thaddeus rode into town for supplies and a bottle. He told Violet he would be back by supper, and she better have his meal ready and his bed warm. She nodded and kept her eyes down and waited until the dust from his horse faded into nothing. Then she walked into the house and stood in the middle of the kitchen with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had maybe 4 hours, maybe 5 if he stopped at the saloon. It was not enough time to run far, but it was enough time to try. She had been planning this moment for weeks. Every time Thaddeus left the ranch, she watched the clock and counted the hours and tried to imagine herself brave enough to finally do it. She packed a small sack with cornbread and jerky and a tin cup. She took a canteen and filled it from the well. She did not take anything else because anything else would be noticed. She thought about the rifle again, but she knew if she took it, Thaddeus would hunt her down. Just for that, and she did not want to give him another reason. She thought about taking one of her mother's dresses from the trunk, but it felt too heavy to carry and too painful to touch. Instead, she wore the same faded calico she always wore, and the same worn boots that pinched her toes. She looked around the kitchen one last time. At the table where she had eaten 1,000 silent meals. At the stove where she had burned her hands learning to cook the way Thaddeus liked. At the door to her room where the lock had been broken since the first night he came for her. She felt nothing. No sadness. No relief. Just a cold determination to leave and never come back. She walked out the back door and headed north toward the canyon country, where the Comanche still rode and where white settlers feared to go. She figured if she was going to die anyway, she would rather die free than die in Thaddeus Boone's bed. The land rose slowly into red rock and juniper. The heat was brutal, and the sun felt like a branding iron against her shoulders. She had no hat and no horse, and her boots were worn thin, but she kept walking. Every step took her farther from the ranch and closer to something unknown. She did not know if that unknown was better or worse. She only knew it was different. And different was all she had left to hope for. By the time the sun started sinking, she had maybe made 8 miles. Her legs ached and her throat burned, and she knew Thaddeus would have found her gone by now. He would be riding after her. He would be furious. She tried not to think about what he would do when he caught her. Instead, she focused on putting one foot in front of the other. She crossed a dry wash and climbed a rocky slope, and when she reached the top, she saw something that made her freeze. The land opened up into a wide basin dotted with juniper and scrub oak. And rising from a draw maybe a mile ahead was smoke. Thin and gray against the darkening sky. Violet's first instinct was to run the other way because smoke meant people, and people meant danger. But then she thought about Thaddeus behind her, and the empty land around her, and the fact that she had no food and no plan, and night was coming fast. Maybe people were a risk, but maybe people were also a chance. She stood there for a long moment trying to decide. Her legs were shaking from exhaustion, and her mouth was so dry she could barely swallow. She thought about her mother, about the way she used to sing while she worked, about the way she had held Violet's hand during the thunderstorms and told her to be brave. Violet had not felt brave in a very long time. But she took a breath and started walking toward the smoke. When she got close enough to see the camp, her stomach dropped. It was not a settler camp. It was Comanche. She counted 4 horses and 3 men sitting near a small fire. They had not seen her yet. She could still turn back. But even as she thought it, she knew turning back meant walking straight into Thaddeus. And suddenly dying at the hands of Comanche warriors seemed like a kinder fate than going back to that ranch. So she did something that most white women in Texas would call insane. She stepped out into the open and raised her hands and walked toward the fire. The Comanche saw her immediately. All 3 men stood in one smooth motion, and one of them reached for a rifle. Violet stopped walking, but kept her hands up. Her voice came out hoarse and shaky. She said she needed help. She said she was running from a bad man. She said she knew they had no reason to trust her, but she had nowhere else to go. The words felt small and useless against the size of the sky, and the silence of the men staring at her. She could see their faces now in the firelight. One was young, maybe her age, with paint across his cheekbones. Another was older with gray streaking his braids. And the third was somewhere in between. Tall and broad with long black hair tied back and a scar running from his temple to his jaw. For a long moment no one moved. Then the man with the scar stepped forward. He wore buckskin leggings and a faded blue shirt that might have come from a raid or a trade. His eyes were dark and sharp, and they studied her like she was a puzzle he was trying to solve. He spoke in English. His voice was low and careful. He asked her why she was alone. He asked her where she came from. He asked her what kind of bad man she was running from. The other two men stayed back, but they watched her closely. The young one still had his hand near his knife. Violet's throat tightened. She had not spoken the truth out loud to anyone in 2 years. But standing there in front of this man with the firelight flickering between them, she felt something crack open inside her. She told him. Not all of it. Not the worst parts. But enough. She said her stepfather had used her. She said he wanted her to bear his child. She said if she went back, he would kill her or worse. Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for it, but she could not stop the tears that came after. They ran hot down her cheeks and dripped off her chin, and she did not bother wiping them away because her hands were still raised, and she was afraid. If she moved too quickly, they would see her as a threat. The man with the scar did not look away. He did not mock her or dismiss her. He just stood there listening. When she finished, he turned and spoke to the other two men in Comanche. They answered back, and there was a brief exchange that Violet could not follow. The young one seemed angry. The older one seemed cautious. The man with the scar seemed calm. He spoke again, and this time his voice was firmer, and the other two men nodded. Then he turned back to Violet. He said his name was Stone Bear. He said she could stay by the fire tonight. He said in the morning they would decide what to do. It was not a promise, but it was not a rejection either. And for Violet, that was more than she had expected. She lowered her hands slowly, and her arms ached from holding them up for so long. Stone Bear gestured toward the fire, and she walked forward on shaky legs. She sat down near the flames and wrapped her arms around her knees. The warmth felt good against her skin. One of the other men handed her a piece of dried meat, and she ate it slowly. It was tough and salty, and the best thing she had tasted in days. No one spoke. The night settled in around them, heavy and full of stars. Violet kept glancing at Stone Bear. He sat across the fire cleaning his knife with a piece of soft leather. His face was unreadable. She wondered what he was thinking. She wondered if he believed her. She wondered if he would let Thaddeus take her back when he came. The young warrior whose name she did not know kept staring at her. Not in the way Carl stared. This was different. It was curiosity mixed with suspicion. Finally he spoke in halting English. He asked her if she had ever killed a Comanche. Violet shook her head. He asked if her people had. She said she did not know. He nodded slowly and went back to sharpening his blade. The older man said nothing at all. He smoked a pipe and watched the horizon like he expected trouble to ride in any moment. Stone Bear finally put his knife away and looked at Violet. He asked her if the bad man would follow. She said yes. He asked how many men would come with him. She said maybe 2. Stone Bear nodded. He said they would keep watch tonight. He said if the man came, they would see him first. Violet wanted to ask what would happen then, but she was afraid of the answer. Instead, she pulled her knees tighter to her chest and stared into the fire. The flames danced and crackled and threw shadows across the rocks. She thought about Thaddeus riding through the dark looking for her. She thought about the rage that would be burning in his chest. She thought about what he would do if he found this camp, Stone Bear stood and said something to the young warrior. The young man nodded and grabbed his rifle and walked out into the darkness to keep watch. The older man wrapped himself in a blanket and lay down near the horses. Stone Bear stayed by the fire. He looked at Violet and told her to sleep if she could. He said she was safe here tonight. Violet did not believe him, but she also did not have the strength to stay awake. She lay down on the hard ground with her sack as a pillow and closed her eyes. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote somewhere out in the dark. She woke once in the night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the stars were so bright, they looked like holes punched in the sky. Stone Bear was still awake. He sat with his back against a rock and his rifle across his lap. He was looking out toward the south, toward the direction she had come from. Violet watched him for a moment. His profile was sharp in the faint light. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen too much and carried too much, and had long ago stopped expecting the world to be kind. She wondered why he had let her stay. She wondered what it cost him. Then she closed her eyes again and let the exhaustion pull her under. When she woke again, it was dawn. The sky was pale gray and the air was cool. The fire was cold. Stone Bear was crouched near the horses checking their hooves. The young warrior was back from his watch and was eating something from a leather pouch. The older man was rolling up his blanket. No one had woken her. She sat up slowly and her whole body ached. Stone Bear saw her move and walked over. He handed her the canteen and she drank. The water was warm, but it felt like a blessing. He asked her if she still wanted to run. She said yes. He asked her where she would go. She said she did not know. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. Then he said something that made her heart stop. He said Thaddeus Boone had ridden past their camp in the night. He said they had seen him from the ridge. He said the man looked like he was tracking something. Violet's blood went cold. She asked if Thaddeus had seen them. Stone Bear shook his head. He said they had stayed hidden. But he also said the man would circle back. He said men like that always did. Violet felt the fear rising in her chest again. She asked Stone Bear what she should do. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said she had two choices. She could keep running and hope Thaddeus did not find her. Or she could let Stone Bear and his men handle it. Violet did not understand. She asked him what he meant by handle it. Stone Bear's expression did not change. He said if she told him where Thaddeus Boone lived, he would make sure the man never hurt her again. The words hung in the air between them. Violet understood what he was offering. And for the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. Stone Bear and his men broke camp before the sun fully rose. They moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years spent on the move, years spent watching their backs. Violet stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of what to do with her hands or where to look. The young warrior whose name she learned was Swift Blade kept glancing at her with barely concealed distrust. The older man called Gray Feather ignored her entirely as he packed the remaining supplies onto the horses. Only Stone Bear seemed unbothered by her presence, as if taking in a fleeing white girl was something he did every other Tuesday. He approached her as the others finished loading the horses. He asked if she could ride. Violet nodded. She had learned to ride when her mother was still alive, back when the world made sense, and her biggest worry was whether the garden would produce enough tomatoes for canning. Stone Bear gestured toward one of the horses, a paint mare with kind eyes. He told her she would ride with them until they reached the canyon where his band was camped. He said once they got there, the elders would decide what to do with her. Violet's stomach tightened at that, but she did not argue. She had no leverage here, no power, no options. She would go where they took her, and hope it was better than where she had been. They rode north into country that grew rougher with every mile. The flat scrubland gave way to broken mesas and deep arroyos carved out, by flash floods that came once a decade and tore the earth apart. The sun climbed higher and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. Violet's head throbbed and her skin burned, but she kept her mouth shut. She would not complain. She would not give Swiftblade another reason to look at her like she was a burden they should have left behind. Stone Bear rode at the front, his posture relaxed but his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Gray Feather rode beside him, occasionally pointing at something in the distance that Violet could not see. Swiftblade brought up the rear, staying close to Violet like he expected her to bolt or pull a hidden weapon. She wondered what they thought of her. A white girl running from her own people. A girl who had walked into their camp and begged for help from the very men her kind had been killing and displacing for decades. She wondered if they hated her. She would not blame them if they did. They stopped once near a shallow creek to water the horses. Violet climbed down stiffly and knelt by the water. She splashed her face and neck and drank until her stomach felt heavy. When she looked up, Stone Bear was standing a few feet away watching her. He asked if she was hurt. She shook her head. He asked if she needed to rest. She said no, even though her legs were trembling and her back ached from the unfamiliar saddle. He studied her face for a moment, like he was trying to decide if she was lying. Then he nodded and walked back to his horse. Gray Feather approached the creek and crouched beside her. He did not look at her, but he spoke in slow, careful English. He said that Stone Bear was a good man, but kindness could be dangerous. He said bringing a white girl into their camp would cause trouble. He said some of the warriors had lost families to settlers, and they would not welcome her. Violet felt her throat tighten. She asked if they would kill her. Gray Feather shrugged. He said it depended on what the council decided. He said it also depended on whether she proved herself useful or just another mouth to feed. Then he stood and walked away, leaving Violet sitting by the water with her heart pounding. They rode for another 2 hours before the landscape opened up into a wide canyon with steep red walls and a thin ribbon of water running through the bottom. Violet could see smoke rising from several fires and the shapes of tipis clustered near the canyon wall. There were horses grazing in a makeshift corral and children running between the shelters. It looked peaceful. It looked like a place where people lived instead of just survived. Violet felt a strange ache in her chest. She had not seen a real community since before her mother died. The Boom Ranch had been a prison with only 3 people, and all of them dangerous in their own way. As they descended into the canyon, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Women looked up from scraping hides. Men paused in the middle of sharpening blades. Children froze mid-game and stared. Violet felt the weight of their eyes on her, and she wanted to disappear. She kept her gaze down and focused on the horse's mane in front of her. Stone Bear rode straight to the largest tipi at the center of the camp and dismounted. An older man with gray streaking his long hair stepped out. He wore a breastplate made of bone, and his face was deeply lined. His eyes were sharp and calculating. He looked at Stone Bear, and then at Violet, and his expression darkened. Stone Bear spoke in Comanche. His voice was respectful but firm. The older man listened without interrupting. When Stone Bear finished, the older man responded in a tone that made it clear he was not pleased. Other men began to gather around. Some looked curious. Others looked hostile. Violet saw one warrior spit in the dirt and turn away. She felt her stomach drop. This was a mistake. She should have kept running. She should have taken her chances alone in the desert. Stone Bear gestured for Violet to dismount. She did so clumsily and nearly fell. Her legs had gone numb from the ride. She steadied herself against the horse and then stepped forward. The older man looked her up and down like he was assessing livestock. He asked in broken English why Stone Bear had brought her here. Before Stone Bear could answer, Violet spoke. Her voice was shaky but loud enough to be heard. She said she was running from a man who had hurt her. She said she had nowhere else to go. She said she did not expect kindness, but she was asking for a chance. The older man, whose name she would later learn was Chief Tall Elk, studied her face. He asked what kind of man she was running from. Violet hesitated. Then she told him the truth. She said her stepfather had forced himself on her. She said he wanted her to bear his children. She said he had beaten her when she tried to leave. The camp went very quiet. Even the children stopped playing. Tall Elk's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. He asked if this man would follow her. Violet said yes. Tall Elk nodded slowly. He said they would discuss it. He told Stone Bear to take her to the edge of the camp and keep her there until a decision was made. Stone Bear led Violet to a small clearing near the canyon wall away from the main camp. There was a fire pit and a pile of firewood and nothing else. He told her to wait here. He said someone would bring her food and water. He said she should not wander. She asked what would happen if the council decided against her. Stone Bear looked at her for a long moment. He said they would give her supplies and send her east toward the settlements. He said after that she would be on her own. Violet nodded. It was more than she had expected. Stone Bear turned to leave but then stopped. He said something that surprised her. He said he believed her story. He said he had seen the fear in her eyes, and fear like that did not come from small things. Then he walked away. Violet sat by the cold fire pit and waited. The sun moved across the sky. Her shadow grew long and then disappeared as the light faded. No one came near her. She could hear the sounds of the camp in the distance. Voices and laughter and the whinny of horses. It felt strange to hear normal life happening so close while she sat alone in the dirt, waiting to learn if she would be cast out or allowed to stay. She thought about Thaddeus. She wondered if he was still out there looking for her. She wondered if he had given up or if his rage had only grown stronger. Men like him did not forgive. They did not forget. They hunted. As the stars began to appear, a woman approached carrying a wooden bowl and a skin of water. She was younger than Violet expected, maybe in her mid-20s, with long black hair and a red blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She set the bowl down in front of Violet without a word. Inside was some kind of stew with meat and wild onions. It smelled better than anything Violet had eaten in months. She looked up at the woman and said thank you. The woman did not smile, but she nodded. She said her name was Laughing Bird. She said Stone Bear had asked her to bring food. Violet asked if the council had made a decision. Laughing Bird said not yet. She said these things took time. Then she turned and walked back toward the camp. Violet ate slowly, savoring every bite. The stew was rich and filling, and for the first time in days she felt almost human. When she finished, she lay back on the ground and looked up at the sky. The stars were so thick they looked like spilled salt. She had forgotten how beautiful the night could be when you were not locked inside her room, listening to footsteps in the hall. She closed her eyes and let the exhaustion wash over her. Sleep came quickly. She woke to the sound of voices. It was still dark, but the sky had that pale quality that comes just before dawn. She sat up and saw Stone Bear standing nearby with Tall Elk and two other men she did not recognize. They were speaking in low tones and glancing in her direction. Violet's heart began to race. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her dress. Stone Bear saw her move and walked over. His face was unreadable. He said the council had made a decision. Violet held her breath. He said she could stay. But there were conditions. She would work. She would help the women with their tasks. She would not be given special treatment. And if her stepfather came looking for her, the warriors would not risk their lives to protect her unless she proved herself valuable to the band. Violet felt relief flood through her so powerfully she almost collapsed. She nodded quickly. She said she would work. She said she would do whatever they needed. Stone Bear told her to follow Laughing Bird when the sun came up. He said the woman would show her what to do. Then he walked away. The days that followed were the hardest Violet had ever worked. Laughing Bird was not cruel, but she was not gentle either. She showed Violet how to scrape hides until her hands bled. She taught her how to gather roots and insects and make them into something edible. She made her haul water from the creek until Violet's shoulders burned and her back felt like it might break. The other women watched her with suspicion. They did not speak to her. They did not smile. They treated her like a stray dog that had wandered into camp and might bite if you got too close. But Violet did not complain. She kept her head down and worked until her body ached and her mind went numb. At night she collapsed by the fire pit at the edge of camp and slept hard and dreamless. She did not see much of Stone Bear. He was always out hunting or scouting or sitting in council with the other warriors. When their paths did cross, he would nod at her but nothing more. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she was here to survive, not to make friends. 2 weeks passed. Violet's hands grew calloused. Her skin turned brown from the sun. She learned a few words of Comanche.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
She learned which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick. She learned how to move through the camp without drawing attention. Slowly, very slowly, the women began to tolerate her. Laughing Bird even smiled at her once when Violet successfully skinned a rabbit without ruining the pelt. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory. Then one afternoon everything changed. Violet was carrying water back from the creek when she heard shouting. She looked up and saw warriors running toward the south end of the canyon. Her stomach dropped. She set the water down and followed. When she reached the gathering crowd, she pushed through until she could see what everyone was looking at. 3 riders were approaching. White men. And leading them was Thaddeus Bone. He sat tall in the saddle, his face red from the sun and twisted with fury. Behind him were Carl and another man Violet did not recognize. They were armed. Thaddeus was shouting something about his daughter and his property and the law. The Comanche warriors stood in a line blocking the path into camp. Stone Bear was at the front. His rifle was in his hands but not yet raised. Tall Elk stood beside him. The tension was so thick Violet could barely breathe. Thaddeus's eyes scanned the crowd and then locked onto Violet. His face split into a terrible smile. He pointed at her and shouted that she was his and he was taking her home. Violet felt her legs start to shake. All the fear she had buried over the past 2 weeks came rushing back. She wanted to run, but her feet would not move. Stone Bear stepped forward. He told Thaddeus in clear English that the girl was under their protection. He said if Thaddeus wanted her, he would have to go through them first. Thaddeus laughed. It was a cruel, ugly sound. He said he did not care about a bunch of savages and their protection. He said he had the law on his side. He said Violet was his stepdaughter and she belonged to him. Stone Bear's expression did not change, but his grip on the rifle tightened. He said the law did not reach this canyon. He said Thaddeus should leave while he still could. Carl drew his gun. The Comanche warriors responded instantly. 12 rifles came up. The air crackled with the promise of violence. Violet's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She looked at Thaddeus and saw the rage burning in his eyes. She looked at Stone Bear and saw something else. Something cold and determined. She realized in that moment that this was not going to end with words. Thaddeus spat in the dirt. He said he would be back with more men. He said he would burn this camp to the ground if he had to. Then he yanked his horse around and rode off with Carl and the other man following. The Comanche warriors did not lower their weapons until the riders disappeared from sight. When they finally did, the camp erupted in angry voices. Some warriors wanted to chase them down. Others wanted to pack up and move the camp. Tall Elk raised his hand for silence. He looked at Stone Bear and said something in Comanche. Stone Bear nodded. Then he turned and walked straight toward Violet. His face was hard. He stopped in front of her and asked if she understood what had just happened. Violet nodded. He said Thaddeus would come back. He said next time he would bring more men and more guns. He said the band could not afford a war with the settlers. Not now. Not when they were already being pushed farther and farther into the margins. Violet felt tears sting her eyes. She asked if they were going to send her away. Stone Bear did not answer right away. He looked back at Tall Elk. The old chief was watching them. Then Stone Bear looked at Violet again and said something she did not expect. He said there was another option. He said if she was willing, he would ride to the Boone Ranch and make sure Thaddeus never came back. He said it would be dangerous. He said it might start a conflict that could spill over onto the whole band. But he also said he had seen what men like Thaddeus did to women, and he would not let it continue. Not if he could stop it. Violet stared at him. She asked why he would risk so much for her. Stone Bear was quiet for a moment. Then he said because no one should have to live the way she had been living. He said because some things were worth fighting for even when the odds were bad. Violet felt something break open inside her chest. She nodded. She said if he was willing to go, she would tell him everything he needed to know. She would tell him where Thaddeus slept and when he was alone and how to get in and out without being seen. Stone Bear nodded. He said they would leave at dawn. Stone Bear left before the sun touched the canyon walls. He took Swift Blade with him and one other warrior named Red Cloud, who was known for moving through the dark like smoke. Violet watched them ride out from her place by the fire pit. Her hands twisted together so tight her knuckles went white. She had told Stone Bear everything the night before. The layout of the ranch. The times when Thaddeus would be alone. The fact that Carl slept in the bunkhouse and Esteban in a small shack behind the barn. She had drawn a map in the dirt with a stick showing where the doors were and which windows did not latch properly. Stone Bear had listened without interrupting, his dark eyes focused and calm. When she finished, he had simply nodded and said they would handle it. Then he walked away, leaving Violet alone with the weight of what she had just set in motion. The camp felt different after the warriors left. There was a tension in the air that had not been there before. The women worked quietly, their faces tight with worry. The children sensed something was wrong and stayed close to their mothers. Tall Elk sat outside, his tippy smoking his pipe and staring toward the south like he could see all the way to the Boone Ranch if he looked hard enough. Violet tried to work, but her hands shook so badly she kept dropping things. Laughing Bird finally told her to sit down before she hurt herself. Violet obeyed and spent the rest of the morning staring at the canyon entrance, waiting for riders that would not return for hours. Gray Feather found her in the afternoon. He sat down beside her without asking and for a long time said nothing. Then he spoke in his slow, careful English. He said Stone Bear was a good fighter, but he was also reckless when he believed something was right. He said the warrior had lost his wife and daughter 3 years ago to a cavalry raid. He said since then Stone Bear had been different, quieter, angrier, more willing to take risks that other men would avoid. Violet listened with her throat tight. She asked if Gray Feather thought Stone Bear would come back. The old warrior shrugged. He said it depended on how many men were at the ranch and how much luck they had. He said luck was a fickle thing, and it did not favor anyone for long. Night fell and still the warriors did not return. Violet could not eat. She sat by the fire pit wrapped in a blanket that Laughing Bird had given her and watched the stars wheel overhead. She thought about Stone Bear riding through the dark toward a man who would kill him without hesitation if given the chance. She thought about what would happen if Thaddeus won. He would come back to the canyon, and this time he would bring an army. He would burn everything and everyone who had sheltered her. The guilt was crushing. She had brought this danger to these people. She had asked for help, and now good men were riding toward violence because of her. Laughing Bird sat down beside her. The woman did not speak at first. She just stared into the fire. Then she said something that surprised Violet. She said Stone Bear had chosen to go. She said no one had forced him. She said warriors made their own decisions and lived with the consequences. Violet asked if Laughing Bird was angry with her. The woman looked at her for a long moment. She said anger was useless. She said what mattered now was whether Violet would honor the risk Stone Bear was taking. She said the best way to do that was to prove she belonged here. To work harder. To learn faster. To become part of the band instead of just a burden they carried. Violet nodded. She understood. Words meant nothing. Only actions mattered. The next day dragged like a wounded animal. Violet worked until her muscles screamed. She hauled water and gathered wood and helped scrape a deer hide that one of the hunters had brought in. She did not stop. She did not rest. She pushed herself until Laughing Bird physically pulled her away from the work and told her to drink water before she collapsed. Violet drank and then went back to work. She needed to stay busy. If she stopped moving, her mind filled with terrible images. Stone Bear lying in the dirt with a bullet in his chest. Thaddeus riding toward the canyon with 20 men behind him. The camp burning. Children screaming. By the time the sun started to set, Violet was swaying on her feet. Laughing Bird made her sit and brought her food. Violet ate without tasting it. Then she returned to the fire pit and waited. The camp grew quiet as families settled in for the night. The fires burned low. The stars came out cold and bright. Violet pulled the blanket tighter and told herself that no news was good news. If something had gone terribly wrong, someone would have ridden back to warn the camp. The fact that no one had come meant the warriors were still alive. Or at least she hoped that was what it meant. She must have dozed off because when she opened her eyes again, the sky was starting to lighten in the east. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding. The camp was still quiet. Then she heard it. The sound of horses. She stood and turned toward the canyon entrance. 3 riders emerged from the shadows. Stone Bear was in front. Swift Blade and Red Cloud followed. They looked exhausted and covered in dust, but they were alive. Violet felt her knees go weak with relief. She wanted to run toward them, but she forced herself to stay where she was. She was not family. She had no right to greet them. Stone Bear dismounted slowly, like every movement hurt. He handed his reins to one of the young boys who ran up to take them. Then he walked toward Tall Elk's tipi. The old chief was already standing outside waiting. They spoke in low voices. Violet could not hear what they said, but she watched Stone Bear's face. It was hard and grim. Whatever had happened at the ranch, it had not been easy. After a few minutes, Tall Elk nodded and placed a hand on Stone Bear's shoulder. Then Stone Bear turned and walked toward Violet. He stopped a few feet away from her. His shirt was torn and there was dry blood on his sleeve, but he did not seem to be badly hurt. He looked at her with those dark, unreadable eyes and said 3 words. "It is done." Violet's breath caught. She asked if Thaddeus was dead. Stone Bear nodded. He said they had found him alone in the house, just like she said they would. He said it had been quick. Violet felt a strange mix of emotions crash over her: relief, guilt, grief for the girl she used to be, who would have been horrified by this. Gratitude for the man standing in front of her, who had done what no one else would. She asked about Carl and Esteban. Stone Bear said Carl had been in the bunkhouse and had come out shooting when he heard the noise. He said Red Cloud had put an arrow through his chest before he could get off a second shot. He said Esteban had run into the dark and they had let him go. The old man was not a threat. Stone Bear said they had taken Thaddeus's guns and his horse and left the bodies where they fell. He said by the time anyone found them, it would be too late to track where the warriors had gone. Violet nodded slowly. She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small. Stone Bear seemed to understand. He told her to get some rest. He said the hard part was over, but he was wrong. The hard part was just beginning. 3 days later, a group of settlers rode into the canyon. There were 5 of them, all armed, all angry. They demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. Tall Elk came out to meet them with Stone Bear and several other warriors at his side. The settlers said they had found 2 bodies at the Boone Ranch. They said they knew Comanche were responsible. They said if the killers were not handed over, there would be consequences. Tall Elk listened without expression. Then he said in broken English that he knew nothing about dead settlers. He said his people had been in the canyon for weeks. He said if the settlers wanted to search the camp, they were welcome to try, but they should know it would not end well for them. The lead settler was a man named Porter. He was older, maybe 50, with a gray beard and cold blue eyes. He looked at Stone Bear and said he had heard rumors about a white girl being held here. He said if that was true, it was a crime, and they would bring the full weight of the law down on this camp. Stone Bear did not flinch. He said there was no white girl being held. He said there was a woman who had come seeking refuge from a man who had hurt her. He said she was free to leave any time she wanted. Porter demanded to see her. Tall Elk hesitated. Then he nodded. He sent one of the young warriors to fetch Violet. When Violet walked into the center of the camp and saw the settlers, her stomach turned. She recognized one of them, a man named Briggs who had worked for Thaddeus a few years back. He stared at her like he was seeing a ghost. Porter stepped forward and asked if she was Violet Porter. She said yes. He asked if these Indians had taken her against her will. Violet looked at Stone Bear, then she looked back at Porter. She said no. She said she had come here running from her stepfather who had beaten and raped her. She said the Comanche had given her shelter when no one else would. Porter's expression hardened. He said Thaddeus Boone was a respected landowner. He said making accusations against a dead man was convenient. Violet felt anger flare hot in her chest. She stepped closer to Porter and looked him dead in the eye. She said Thaddeus Boone was a monster. She said he had forced himself on her for 2 years. She said he had told her she would bear his children whether she wanted to or not. She said if Porter did not believe her, he could ask Esteban, who had seen the bruises and heard her crying and done nothing. Porter's jaw tightened. He said even if that were true, it did not give savages the right to murder a white man. Violet said it gave someone the right to stop him. She said if the law would not protect her, then she had to find protection somewhere else. Briggs spoke up then. He said Violet had always been trouble. He said she had a wild streak and everyone knew it. He said for all they knew, she had run off with some cowboy and made up this story to cover her shame. Violet felt her face flush with rage. Before she could respond, Stone Bear moved. He stepped between Violet and the settlers, and his hand rested on the knife at his belt. He said the girl had told the truth. He said he had seen the fear in her eyes and the marks on her skin. He said any man who called her a liar would answer to him. Porter raised his hands in a placating gesture. He said there was no need for threats. He said if Violet wanted to stay with the Comanche, that was her choice. But he also said that the deaths of Thaddeus Boone and Carl would not be forgotten. He said the territorial government would hear about this. He said there would be soldiers coming to ask questions. Then he and his men mounted their horses and rode out. The camp watched them go in tense silence. After they left, Tall Elk called a council. All the warriors gathered in his tipi, and Violet was told to wait outside. She sat with Laughing Bird and listened to the raised voices inside. She could not understand the words, but she understood the tone. They were arguing about what to do. Some wanted to move the camp immediately. Others wanted to prepare for a fight. Laughing Bird said quietly that this was what she had feared. She said bringing Violet here had put the whole band in danger. Violet felt the guilt crushing her again. She said she would leave. She said she would go east to the settlements and tell anyone who asked that they Comanche had nothing to do with Thaddeus's death. Laughing Bird shook her head. She said it was too late for that. She said the settlers had already made up their minds. The council lasted until well after dark. When the warriors finally emerged, Stone Bear looked exhausted. He found Violet and told her the decision. They would move the camp deeper into the canyon country, where soldiers would have a harder time finding them. They would send scouts to watch for any patrols. And Violet would stay with them. Tall Elk had decided that turning her over to the settlers would accomplish nothing. It would not bring back the dead men, and it would not satisfy the anger. Violet asked if Stone Bear agreed with the decision. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said it did not matter if he agreed. The decision was made. Over the next week the band packed up everything and moved. It was hard, brutal work. They traveled through narrow passes and over rocky terrain that threatened to break the horses' legs. They camped in places with little water and less shelter. The women worked without complaint, but Violet could see the resentment in some of their eyes. She was the reason they had to leave. She was the reason their children were hungry and tired and scared. She tried to make herself useful. She carried more than her share. She gave her food to the children when supplies ran low. She stayed up late, helping repair torn blankets and broken tools. Slowly, grudgingly, the resentment began to ease. Stone Bear was different after the move. He spent more time alone. He would sit on high rocks overlooking the camp and stare out at the horizon like he was waiting for something. Violet wanted to talk to him, but she did not know what to say. One evening she climbed up to where he was sitting and simply sat down beside him. For a long time neither of them spoke. Then Stone Bear said something that surprised her. He said he did not regret killing Thaddeus. He said he had done what needed to be done. But he also said he knew it would bring trouble. He said trouble always followed violence, no matter how justified. Violet said she was sorry. Stone Bear shook his head. He said she had nothing to be sorry for. He said the fault lay with the men who hurt her, not with her for running. She asked him why he had helped her. He did not answer right away. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning deep orange and purple. Finally he said that his wife had been taken by soldiers during a raid. He said they had done things to her before they killed her. He said when he looked at Violet, he saw his wife. He saw a woman who had been broken by men who believed they had the right. He said he could not save his wife, but maybe he could save Violet. It was not much, but it was something. Violet felt tears slip down her cheeks. She reached out and touched his hand. It was the first time she had touched him since the day he found her at their camp. His skin was warm and rough with calluses. He did not pull away. They sat like that as the sun disappeared and the stars came out. And for the first time since her mother died, Violet felt like maybe she was not completely alone in the world. 2 weeks later, the scouts reported soldiers moving through the area. A full patrol. Maybe 20 men. They were asking questions in every camp they found. They were looking for the men who killed Thaddeus Boone, and they were not being gentle about it. Tall Elk called another council. This time Violet was brought inside. The old chief looked at her and asked if she understood what her presence had cost them. Violet said yes. He asked if she was willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the band. She said yes. He nodded slowly. Then he said there was only one way to keep the soldiers from tearing the camp apart, looking for her. He said she would have to become Comanche. Not in name but in truth. She would have to learn their language. Follow their customs. Prove that she was not a captive, but a member of the band. And if soldiers came, she would have to stand with the people and not flinch. Violet understood what he was asking. He was asking her to choose. To stop being the white girl who had run away and become something else entirely. She looked around the tipi at the faces watching her. Gray Feather, Swift Blade, Red Cloud, and Stone Bear. They were waiting for her answer. Violet took a breath and said she would do it. She said she would learn. She said she would prove herself. Tall Elk studied her face for a long moment. Then he said if she failed, the band would cast her out and she would face the soldiers alone. Violet nodded. She understood the stakes. This was her last chance. The transformation did not happen overnight. Violet had thought perhaps there would be some ceremony, some ritual that would mark her transition from outsider to member of the band, but there was nothing like that. Instead, Laughing Bird came to her the morning after the council and handed her a dress made of soft deerskin, with fringe along the sleeves and hem. She told Violet to burn her old clothes, the calico dress that still smelled faintly of the Boone Ranch and carried memories she did not want. Violet built a small fire away from camp and watched the fabric curl and blacken and turn to ash. It felt like burning away a part of herself. The part that had been afraid. The part that had been a victim. When the last ember died, she walked back to camp wearing the deerskin and feeling like someone completely new. Laughing Bird became her teacher in everything. She taught Violet how to speak Comanche properly instead of the broken phrases she had picked up. She drilled her on the words for every tool, every animal, every plant until Violet's head ached. She showed her how to bead moccasins and tan hides and preserve meat for winter. She explained the customs around the fire and who could speak when and how to show respect to the elders. Violet absorbed it all desperately. She knew her life depended on it. If the soldiers came and she could not prove she belonged here, they would drag her away and probably hang Stone, Bear, and anyone else they decided was responsible for Thaddeus's death. The other women watched her efforts with varying degrees of skepticism. Some, like Laughing Bird, seemed willing to give her a chance. Others remained cold and distant. There was one woman named Pale Moon who made her hostility obvious. She would spit near Violet's feet when she walked by. She would mutter things in Comanche that Violet did not fully understand, but knew were insults. Laughing Bird told her to ignore it. She said Pale Moon had lost her son to settlers 2 years ago, and she hated all white people without exception. She said time might soften her, or it might not. Either way, Violet had to keep working. Stone Bear kept his distance during those first weeks. Violet would see him around camp, but he rarely spoke to her. She wondered if he regretted helping her. She wondered if he blamed her for the danger the band now faced. One afternoon she gathered her courage and approached him while he was sharpening his knife. She asked if she had done something to offend him. He looked up surprised. He said no. He said he was simply giving her space to find her place among the women. He said if he stayed too close, people would think she was his responsibility, and that would make it harder for her to earn her own respect. Violet understood. But part of her still felt the sting of his absence. 3 weeks after she started learning the Comanche ways, the scouts came running into camp with news. The soldiers were close. Maybe a day's ride south. They were moving methodically through the canyons, questioning every band they found. Tall Elk immediately called the warriors together. He said they would not run again. They had moved twice already, and the people were exhausted. The children were getting sick. The horses were worn thin. If the soldiers came, they would meet them here and try to talk first. But everyone should be prepared for the worst. Violet's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. The moment everything would either hold together or fall apart. Laughing Bird found her standing frozen near the fire pit and grabbed her by the shoulders. She said Violet needed to breathe and focus. She said when the soldiers came, Violet would stay with the women. She would not speak unless spoken to. She would keep her eyes down and act like she had been part of the band her whole life. If anyone asked her questions, she would answer in Comanche, even if they spoke English. She would show no recognition of their language. No familiarity. Nothing that would make them think she was anything other than one of the people. That night Violet could not sleep. She lay in the tipi she now shared with Laughing Bird and 2 other women and stared at the hide walls, listening to the sounds of the camp. Somewhere a baby was crying. A dog barked. She could hear low voices as the warriors kept watch. She thought about the soldiers riding closer with every hour. She thought about what would happen if they recognized her. If someone had brought a description or a sketch. She thought about Stone Bear standing between her and armed men and getting shot for his trouble. The fear was so intense she felt sick. The soldiers arrived just after midday. There were 18 of them, led by a captain with a thick mustache and eyes like chips of flint. They rode into camp slowly, guns visible but not drawn.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The warriors stood in a line at the entrance to the camp, blocking the way forward. Tall Elk stepped out to meet them. The captain dismounted and approached. He spoke loudly in English, asking if anyone here spoke his language. Tall Elk nodded slowly. He said he spoke some. The captain said they were looking for a white girl named Violet Porter. He said she had been taken from her home, and they had reason to believe she was being held by a Comanche band in this area. He said if they handed her over peacefully, there would be no trouble. If they did not, there would be consequences. Tall Elk's face remained impassive. He said there was no white girl here. He said his people had been in this canyon for many seasons. The captain did not look convinced. He said he wanted to search the camp. Tall Elk said that would not be wise. The captain's hand moved toward his sidearm. Immediately, every Comanche warrior raised a weapon. Rifles, bows, knives. The soldiers responded in kind. For a terrible moment, it looked like blood would be spilled right there in the center of camp. Then Stone Bear stepped forward. He spoke in clear English, which surprised the captain. He said if they wanted to look, they could look. He said they had nothing to hide. But he also said if any soldier touched a woman or a child or took anything that did not belong to them, the truce would end and none of them would leave the canyon alive. The captain studied Stone Bear's face. He seemed to be weighing his options. Finally he nodded. He told his men to search but to keep their hands to themselves. The soldiers spread out through the camp. Violet stood with the other women near the hide-scraping racks. Her hands were busy working a deer hide, and she kept her head down. She could feel the soldiers' eyes on her, but she did not look up. One of them stopped nearby. He was young, maybe 20, with red hair and freckles. He asked in English if any of the women spoke his language. No one answered. He tried again. Violet's hands kept moving. She forced herself to breathe slowly. The soldier stepped closer. He was looking right at her now. He said something about her skin being lighter than the others. He said she looked like she might be white. Laughing Bird stepped between them and spoke sharply in Comanche. She gestured at the soldier to move on. He hesitated. Then an older sergeant called him back. The young soldier gave Violet one last look and walked away. Violet's hands were shaking so badly she had to stop working. Laughing Bird leaned close and whispered in Comanche to stay calm, to keep breathing. The worst was almost over. The soldiers searched for nearly an hour. They looked in every tipi. They questioned several of the men. They stared hard at Violet twice more, but each time one of the women would step in front of her or distract the soldiers with some task. Finally, the captain called his men back. He walked up to Tall Elk and said he did not find the girl. He said, but if they were lying, the army would return with more men and burn this camp to ash. Tall Elk said nothing. The captain mounted his horse, and the soldiers rode out. The camp stayed silent until they were completely out of sight. Then everyone exhaled at once. Violet's legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the ground. Laughing Bird knelt beside her and put a hand on her shoulder. She said Violet had done well. She said the soldiers had looked right at her and seen only another Comanche woman. Violet wanted to feel relieved, but all she felt was exhausted. Stone Bear walked over. He looked down at her, and for the first time in weeks he smiled. It was small and brief, but it was there. He said she had earned her place. He said no one could question it now. That night there was a gathering around the central fire. It was not a celebration exactly, but there was a sense of relief in the air. The danger had passed, at least for now. Tall Elk stood and spoke in Comanche. Violet understood most of it. He said the band had faced a test and come through it together. He said the woman who had come to them seeking protection had proven herself worthy. He said from this day forward she would be known as Blue Sky, woman, because she had fallen from the white world like rain from a clear sky and found new life among the people. There was a murmur of approval from the gathered crowd. Even Pale Moon did not object, though her face remained hard. Violet felt tears prick her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She stood when Tall Elk gestured for her to approach the fire. She walked forward on unsteady legs. The old chief placed his hand on her head in a gesture of blessing. Then he stepped back and the women began to sing. It was a song. Violet did not know, but the sound of it wrapped around her like a warm blanket. She looked across the fire and met Stone Bear's eyes. He nodded once. A silent acknowledgement. She had survived. She had become something new. The days after that were different. The women no longer treated her like an outsider. They included her in their conversations. They laughed when she made mistakes with the language. They corrected her gently instead of with impatience. Even Pale Moon stopped spitting near her feet, though she still did not speak to her. Violet worked hard and learned fast. She discovered she had a talent for beadwork, and her moccasins began to be sought after by others in the band. It was a small thing, but it made her feel useful. It made her feel like she had something to contribute. Stone Bear started spending more time near her again. Not in an obvious way, but he would sit by the fire in the evenings when she was working, and they would talk. Quiet conversations about small things. The weather, the hunt, the stories of his people. Violet learned that he had been a warrior since he was 15. That he had fought in more battles than he could count. That he was tired of fighting but did not know how to stop. She told him about her mother. About the garden they used to keep and the songs they would sing while they worked. About the girl she used to be before Thaddeus destroyed everything. Stone Bear listened without judgment. He said the past was gone, but it lived in memory, and memory could be a kind of medicine if you did not let it poison you. One evening he asked her if she missed the white world. Violet thought about it for a long time. Then she said no. She said there was nothing there for her anymore. No family. No home. No one who would understand what she had been through. Here she had a place. Here she had people who had risked their lives for her. Here she could sleep without fear. Stone Bear nodded. He said he was glad. Then he said something that made her heart skip. He said if she wanted, he would teach her to ride the way the Comanche rode. Fast and fearless. She said yes immediately. The lessons began the next day. Stone Bear was a patient teacher, but he demanded excellence. He showed her how to mount without a saddle, how to grip with her knees and guide the horse with her body instead of reins, how to lean low and fast when riding at full speed. Violet fell more times than she could count. Her body was covered in bruises, but she got back on every time. She refused to quit. After 2 weeks she could ride well enough that Stone Bear said she would not embarrass herself. After a month she could keep up with the other riders during a hunt. She felt powerful in a way she never had before. Like she was in control of her own body and her own fate. The band settled into a rhythm as summer gave way to fall. The hunts were good. The weather held. There were no more soldiers. Violet's Comanche became fluent enough that she dreamed in the language. She stopped thinking of herself as Violet Porter and started thinking of herself as Blue Sky, woman. It was not that she forgot who she had been, but that girl felt distant now, like someone she used to know a long time ago. This new person she was becoming felt stronger, braver, more alive. Then one night everything shifted again. There was a dance around the fire. The warriors had returned from a successful hunt and brought back 2 elk and a buffalo calf. The women prepared a feast and everyone ate until they were full. Then the drums started and people began to dance. Violet watched from the edge of the circle. She did not know the steps. Laughing Bird pulled her to her feet and dragged her into the circle anyway. She stumbled through the movements, laughing at her own clumsiness. The other women laughed with her, not at her. It felt good to laugh. It felt good to move without fear. When the dance ended and people began to drift back to their tipis, Stone Bear appeared at her side. He asked if she would walk with him. Violet's heart started pounding, but she nodded. They walked away from the camp toward a rise that overlooked the canyon. The moon was nearly full, and the light turned everything silver. Stone Bear stopped at the top of the rise and looked out at the view. He said he had something to tell her. Violet waited. He said he had been thinking about the future, about what would happen when winter came and the band moved to lower ground. He said he wanted her to stay, not just as a member of the band, but as his woman. If she would have him. Violet stared at him. She had not expected this. She had thought maybe he cared for her as a friend, as someone he had saved. But this was something else. He was asking her to bind her life to his, to become his partner in the eyes of the people. She asked him why. He said because she was brave, because she had survived things that would have broken most people, because when he looked at her, he saw someone worth fighting for, worth building a life with. He said he knew she might not feel the same. He said if she needed time, he would wait. But he wanted her to know. Violet felt tears spill down her cheeks. She said yes. She said she did not need time. She said she had never felt safer or more valued than she did when she was with him. Stone Bear smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and solid. He said they would tell Tall Elk in the morning. He said there would be a ceremony. Nothing big, but something to mark the joining. Violet nodded. She could not find words. All she could do was stand there holding his hand and looking out at the canyon bathed in moonlight and feeling like maybe after everything she had been through, she had finally found a place where she belonged. The ceremony happened 3 days later under a sky so clear it looked like polished turquoise. Tall Elk performed the rites with Gray Feather standing beside him as witness. There were no elaborate decorations, no grand feast, just the essential elements that bound 2 lives together in the eyes of the people. Stone Bear wore his finest buckskin shirt, decorated with quillwork his mother had made years before she passed. Violet wore the dress Laughing Bird had given her when she first arrived, now adorned with beadwork she had stitched herself during the long evenings by the fire. Her hands had bled learning the craft, but every bead felt like a small victory, a tiny piece of proof that she could create beauty instead of just surviving ugliness. The band gathered in a circle around them. Even Pale Moon attended, though she stood at the back with her arms crossed. Tall Elk spoke in Comanche about the sacred bond between man and woman, about how 2 people could become stronger together than they ever were apart. He talked about the responsibilities they would carry, not just to each other, but to the entire band. Every person here depended on every other person for survival. A marriage was not just a private matter. It was a thread woven into the fabric of the community. Stone Bear and Violet each spoke their commitment aloud. Her voice shook, but she did not falter. When it was done, Tall Elk tied a length of braided cord around their joined hands. He said what was bound here could not be easily broken. Then he released them, and the people began to sing. That night they moved into Stone Bear's tipi together. It was larger than the one Violet had shared with the women, with space for sleeping and storage and a fire pit in the center. Stone Bear had placed fresh sage on the floor, and the smell filled the space with something clean and sharp. Violet stood just inside the entrance, feeling suddenly nervous. This was different from what Thaddeus had done to her. This was her choice. But her body still remembered the fear and the pain, and for a moment, she froze. Stone Bear noticed immediately. He stepped back and told her they did not have to do anything tonight. He said they could just sleep. He said she could take all the time she needed. Violet looked at him standing there in the firelight, this man who had killed for her, who had risked everything to give her a chance at a new life. She took a breath and said she wanted to try. She said she was afraid, but she also wanted to know what it felt like to be touched by someone who cared about her. Stone Bear nodded slowly. He approached her like she was a wild thing that might spook. He took her hand gently and led her to the sleeping furs. He moved carefully, always watching her face, always giving her space to pull away if she needed to. And when they came together, it was nothing like what she had known before. There was no violence, no pain, just warmth and gentleness, and a kind of closeness she had not known was possible. Afterward she cried, but they were different tears. Not tears of grief, but tears of release. Stone Bear held her and said nothing, and that was exactly what she needed. The winter came hard that year. The band moved to lower ground near a river valley where there was more shelter from the wind. Snow fell thick and heavy, turning the world white and silent. Food became scarce. The hunters went out every day and came back with less and less. Violet worked alongside the other women, preserving what little meat they had, gathering roots from the frozen ground, making soup from bones that had already been boiled twice before. Children cried from hunger. The elderly grew weak. It was the kind of winter that tested everyone's resolve. Stone Bear was gone more than he was home. He and the other warriors ranged far looking for game. Sometimes they were gone for days. Violet would lie awake at night, listening to the wind howl and wondering if he would come back. Wondering if he had frozen somewhere out in the empty white, or been caught by soldiers, or injured by a buffalo. Every time he returned, she felt a surge of relief so powerful it made her dizzy. He would stumble into the tipi half frozen, and she would help him out of his wet clothes, and wrap him in furs, and make him drink hot broth until the color returned to his face. One particularly brutal night, a blizzard hit that lasted 3 days. The wind screamed like something alive, and the snow piled so high against the tipis that people had to dig their way out. Violet and Stone Bear huddled together under every blanket they owned. They talked to pass the time. He told her stories about his childhood, about learning to ride before he could walk, about the first time he killed a buffalo and how proud his father had been. She told him about her mother's garden, about the way sunflowers would turn their faces toward the light, about the lullabies her mother used to sing. They were sharing pieces of themselves that had nothing to do with survival or suffering, just memories of being human. When the blizzard finally broke, the band emerged to find 2 of the elderly had died in the night. The cold had been too much for their worn bodies. Tall Elk led the morning rituals, and they buried the dead as best they could in the frozen ground. It was a grim reminder that winter was not just uncomfortable. It was deadly. Violet threw herself into work even harder. She could not bring back the dead, but she could help keep the living alive. She rationed her own food to give extra to the children. She stayed up late sewing torn clothing and patching holes in tipis. Laughing Bird told her she would work herself to death if she was not careful. Violet said death from exhaustion seemed better than death from guilt. As winter dragged on, something began to shift in Violet's body. At first she thought it was just the lack of food making her feel sick. But then her monthly bleeding stopped and her breasts grew tender, and she knew. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She sat alone in the tipi one afternoon with her hand pressed against her still flat stomach and felt terror rise in her throat. The last time she had been pregnant, it had been Thaddeus's child, a product of violence and horror. She had been almost relieved when her body had expelled it after one of his beatings. But this was different. This child was Stone Bear's. This child was made from choice and care. And yet she was still terrified. She did not tell Stone Bear right away. She was afraid of how he would react. Afraid he would be disappointed or worried or would look at her differently. But after a week of keeping the secret, she could not hold it anymore. One night after he returned from a hunt, she told him. He went very still. For a long moment he said nothing, and Violet's heart sank. Then he reached out and placed his hand over hers on her stomach. He said this was a gift. He said a child meant hope. It meant the future was real and worth fighting for. Violet started crying and could not stop. Stone Bear held her and told her everything would be all right. She wanted to believe him. When Laughing Bird found out, she was overjoyed. She immediately began preparing things for the baby, gathering soft furs and making tiny moccasins. The other women were kind in their own way, offering advice and remedies for morning sickness. Even Pale Moon softened slightly. She came to Violet one day and placed a small bundle of herbs in her hand. She said in halting words that they would help with the nausea. It was the first time she had spoken directly to Violet in months. Violet thanked her, and Pale Moon nodded stiffly before walking away. It was not forgiveness exactly, but it was something. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, like it was not sure the winter deserved to end. The snow melted and the river swelled, and green things began to push up through the mud. The hunters found game again, and bellies that had been empty for months were finally full. Violet's body grew round and heavy. She could not ride anymore or do the harder physical work, but she found other ways to be useful. She made baskets and wove blankets and told stories to the children. Stone Bear was protective to the point of being overbearing. He would not let her lift anything heavier than a water skin. He checked on her constantly throughout the day. Violet found it annoying and endearing in equal measure. One warm afternoon in late spring, Violet was sitting by the river washing clothes when she felt the first pain. It was low and deep and unmistakable. She called for Laughing Bird, who came running. The older woman took one look at Violet's face and knew. She helped her back to the tipi and sent one of the children to fetch the other women who assisted with births. Stone Bear was out hunting, and Violet was grateful for that. She did not want him to see her like this, vulnerable and scared and in pain. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. It was harder than anything Violet had ever endured, harder than the beatings, harder than the escape through the desert, harder than learning to be someone new. The pain came in waves that pulled her under and spat her back out. Laughing Bird and the other women stayed with her the entire time, talking her through it, wiping her forehead, telling her she was strong enough to do this. Violet did not feel strong. She felt like she was being torn apart from the inside. But she kept pushing because what else could she do? Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, the baby came. A girl, tiny and red and screaming with outrage at being forced into the world. Laughing Bird cleaned her and wrapped her in soft rabbit fur and placed her in Violet's arms. Violet looked down at the small, furious face and felt something crack open in her chest. Love so fierce it was almost painful. This was her daughter. Not Thaddeus's. Not a product of violence. But hers and Stone Bear's. A child made from choice and hope. She started crying again, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body. The women smiled and told her this was normal. That every mother cried when they first held their child. Stone Bear returned an hour later. He came into the tipi still covered in dust from the trail and froze when he saw Violet holding the baby. Laughing Bird gestured him forward. He approached slowly, almost reverently. Violet held the baby up so he could see. Stone Bear reached out one rough finger and the baby grabbed it with her tiny hand. His face transformed. All the hardness and weariness melted away, and for a moment he looked young again. He said she was perfect. He asked what they should name her. Violet had been thinking about this for weeks. She said she wanted to name her Dawn Star because she was born as the sun was setting, but she represented a new beginning. Stone Bear said it was a good name. The band celebrated the birth with a small feast. It had been a hard winter, and a new baby was a sign that the people would continue, that they would survive despite everything trying to crush them. Tall Elk blessed the child and said she would grow strong like her father and brave like her mother. Violet sat with Dawn Star in her arms and looked around at the faces gathered in the firelight. These people who had taken her in when she had nothing, who had protected her, who had given her a new life. She was no longer Violet Porter, the girl who had been broken and used. She was Blue Sky Woman, wife of Stone Bear, mother of Dawn Star, member of the band. She had become someone new. The years that followed were not easy. There were more soldiers, more conflicts, more winters that tested everyone's strength. The band was forced to move again and again as settlers pushed further into their territory. But through it all, Violet and Stone Bear built a life together. They had 2 more children, both sons, both healthy and loud and full of energy. Violet taught them the songs her mother had taught her, mixing the old world with the new. Stone Bear taught them to ride and hunt and fight when necessary. Dawn Star grew into a fierce young girl who could shoot a bow as well as any of the boys, and who had her mother's stubborn determination. Violet sometimes thought about the girl she used to be, the one who had been tied up and left to die under the Kansas sun. That girl felt like a ghost now, a shadow from another lifetime. She did not miss her exactly, but she honored her, because that girl had been strong enough to run, strong enough to choose possible death over certain horror, strong enough to walk into a Comanche camp and ask for help when every instinct told her to flee. Without that girl's courage, there would be no Blue Sky Woman, no family, no future. On quiet nights when the children were asleep and the camp was settled, Violet would sit with Stone Bear outside their teepee and look up at the stars. He would hold her hand and they would talk about small things or sit in comfortable silence. She thought about everything she had survived, everything she had lost, everything she had gained. The balance was complicated, but sitting there with Stone Bear's hand warm in hers and her children safe inside the teepee, she knew she would make the same choices again. Every single one. Life among the Comanche was never going to be easy. The pressure from settlers and soldiers never truly stopped. There were losses and sorrows that could not be avoided. But there was also love and community and the fierce pride that came from surviving against impossible odds. Violet had learned that healing was not a destination you reached. It was something you did every day. Sometimes you took steps forward. Sometimes you fell back. But you kept going. You kept choosing life over death, hope over despair, connection over isolation. One evening many years later, Violet stood on a ridge overlooking the camp with Dawn Star beside her. Her daughter was 16 now, nearly the same age Violet had been when she ran from Thaddeus. Dawn Star asked her mother if she ever regretted leaving the white world behind. Violet thought about it carefully. She said no. She said the white world had offered her nothing but pain, and she had found everything that mattered here. Dawn Star asked if she ever got scared that the soldiers would come back. Violet said yes. She said fear never fully went away. But neither did courage. You just had to choose which one you listened to. Dawn Star nodded like she understood. Then she asked if her mother would tell her the whole story someday. The story of how she came to be here. Violet said yes. She said when Dawn Star was ready, she would tell her everything. The good and the bad. The darkness and the light. Because it was important to know where you came from, even if where you came from was painful. It helped you understand who you were and why you were strong. As the sun set and turned the sky orange and gold, Violet thought about all the women who had come before her. Her mother who had loved her. The Comanche women who had taught her. Laughing Bird, who had been patient when Violet was clumsy and afraid. She thought about all the women who would come after. Dawn Star and her daughters and their daughters. Women who would face their own battles and make their own choices. She hoped they would be brave. She hoped they would know their own worth. She hoped they would find people who would fight for them the way Stone Bear had fought for her. The world was hard and cruel and often unfair. But it was also full of unexpected kindness. Full of people who would stand up when standing up meant risking everything. Full of second chances for those brave enough to reach for them. Violet had been given a second chance. She had grabbed it with both hands and built a life from the ashes of the old one. Not a perfect life, but a real one. A life that was hers. She turned to Dawnstar and took her daughter's hand. Together they walked back down to camp where Stone Bear was starting a fire and the boys were arguing over whose turn it was to fetch water. The sounds of ordinary life. The sounds of home. Violet smiled. After everything she had been through, everything she had survived, she had finally found what she had been searching for all along. Not just safety, not just freedom, but belonging. A place where she could be herself, broken pieces and all, and still be loved. Still be valued. Still be enough, and that, she thought as she entered the warm circle of firelight with her family around her, was worth every hard step of the journey. The canyon had changed in 3 years. Not in its red stone walls or the way the wind carved patterns through the juniper trees, but in the way it felt. There were fewer tipis now. Fewer horses in the corral. Fewer children running through the camp with their laughter echoing off the rocks. The pressure from settlers had become unbearable, and many families had split off to join other bands further north or to try their luck on the reservation lands that the government kept promising would be safe. Tall Elk had died the winter before, peacefully in his sleep, and Gray Feather had taken his place as chief. The old warrior led with wisdom, but everyone could see the weariness in his eyes. He knew what was coming. They all did. Violet stood at the entrance to her tipi, watching Stone Bear teach their sons how to track. The boys were 7 and 5 now, lean and quick with their father's dark eyes and their mother's stubborn jaw. Dawn Star sat nearby working on a piece of beadwork, her fingers moving with practiced precision. She was 19 and had already turned down 3 marriage proposals. She said she was not ready to belong to anyone but herself yet. Violet understood that better than most. Stone Bear said their daughter had inherited her mother's fierce independence, and he was proud of it even if it gave him gray hairs. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt both fragile and precious. Every day could be the last day of peace. Every sunrise could bring soldiers or settlers, or some new demand from the government agents, who showed up periodically with papers and promises that meant nothing. But the band kept living anyway. Kept hunting and gathering and raising children and telling stories around the fire. What else could they do? Giving up meant dying, and none of them were ready for that. Laughing Bird had married a widower named Black Elk 2 years ago. They had been cautious at first, both of them scarred by previous losses, but they had found something gentle and good together. Violet was happy for her friend. Laughing Bird had been the one who taught her how to survive in this world, and watching her find happiness felt like a kind of completion. Even Pale Moon had softened over the years. She still did not speak much to Violet, but she no longer looked at her with hatred. Time had worn down the sharp edges of her grief into something she could carry without it cutting her constantly. One afternoon a rider came into camp moving fast. It was Swift Blade, who had been out scouting to the south. He went straight to Gray Feather's tipi, and the 2 men spoke in urgent tones. Within minutes, the chief called a gathering. Everyone dropped what they were doing and assembled in the center of camp. Gray Feather's face was grave. He said Swift Blade had seen a large group of soldiers camped 2 days' ride from here. At least 50 men with wagons and supplies. They were clearly preparing for something big. The scout had overheard some of their conversation. They were planning to sweep through all the remaining Comanche camps in the area and force everyone onto the reservation at Fort Sill. Anyone who refused would be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. A murmur of anger and fear rippled through the gathered people. Some of the younger warriors wanted to fight. They said they would rather die free than live caged on reservation land. The older warriors were more cautious. They had fought enough battles to know that 50 soldiers with modern weapons would slaughter them. Gray Feather let everyone speak. Then he said they had 3 choices. They could run deeper into the canyon country and hope the soldiers did not find them. They could surrender and go to the reservation. Or they could split up, with some families going to the reservation and others trying to disappear into smaller groups. The debate lasted until well after dark. Violet sat with Stone Bear and their children, listening to the voices rise and fall. She knew what he was thinking. He wanted to run. He wanted to keep fighting for freedom, even if it meant living on the edge of starvation and danger. But he also had a family now. Children who needed stability and safety. The warrior in him wanted to resist. The father in him knew that resistance might get his children killed. Finally, Stone Bear stood and spoke. He said he had spent his whole life fighting. He said he had lost his first wife and daughter to violence, and he had sworn he would never let that happen again. He said if going to the reservation meant his children would live to see adulthood, then he would go. He said he was not asking anyone else to make that choice. But that was his decision. Violet felt tears sting her eyes. She knew how much it cost him to say those words, to admit that sometimes survival meant surrender. Gray Feather nodded slowly. He said Stone Bear spoke with wisdom. He said he too would take his family to the reservation. He said any families who wished to come with them would leave in 3 days. Anyone who wanted to run was free to do so, and he would not judge them for it. The gathering broke up, with people drifting back to their tipis in small, quiet groups. No one felt like talking. The weight of the decision hung over the camp like smoke. That night, Violet and Stone Bear lay together in the darkness. He held her close, and she could feel the tension in his body. She asked if he was certain about his choice. He said no. He said he was not certain about anything anymore. But he said he remembered what it felt like to lose everything, and he could not risk that again. Violet told him she would go wherever he went. She said 3 years ago she had nothing and no one. Now she had a family and a life worth protecting. The next 3 days were a flurry of activity. People packed what they could carry and buried what they could not. There were quiet goodbyes as some families decided to take their chances in the wild rather than submit to reservation life. Swift Blad was among them. He said he would rather die hunting than live in a cage. Stone Bear embraced him and told him to stay alive if he could. The young warrior smiled and said he would try. On the morning of the 4th day, the remaining families set out toward Fort Sill. There were maybe 30 people left. Gray Feather led the way with Stone Bear and a few other warriors flanking the group to watch for danger. The journey took a week. They moved slowly because of the children and the elderly. They camped each night in silence, everyone lost in their own thoughts about what waited at the end of the road. Violet kept Dawn Star and the boys close. She told them stories at night to keep their minds off their fear. Fort Sill sat on flat open land with wooden buildings and a flag that snapped in the constant wind. There were already hundreds of Comanche there, camped in ragged clusters around the fort. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, and government agents moved between the camps with clipboards and stern faces. When Gray Feather's band arrived, they were processed like cattle. Names were taken. Numbers were assigned. They were told where they could camp and what rations they would receive and what rules they had to follow. No leaving without permission. No weapons. No gathering in large groups. Stone Bear's face was like stone throughout the entire process. Violet could see the fury burning behind his eyes, but he kept it contained. He answered the agent's questions in short clipped words. He took the number they assigned him and the piece of paper that said he was now officially a ward of the United States government. When they were finally dismissed and allowed to set up their tipi, he walked away from the camp and did not return until after dark. The reservation was everything they had feared and worse. The rations were insufficient and often spoiled. The water was bad. Disease spread quickly through the crowded camps. The soldiers treated them with contempt, and the agents treated them like children who needed to be civilized. There were schools where Comanche children were forced to cut their hair and wear white clothing and speak only English. Dawn Star refused to go, and Violet supported her decision even though it meant visits from angry agents. But despite everything, the people adapted. They found ways to keep their culture alive in small, quiet ways. They told stories. They sang songs. They taught their children the old ways even if those ways no longer had a place in the world. Violet threw herself into helping however she could. She worked with the other women to stretch the rations further. She helped care for the sick. She refused to let the reservation break her spirit. Stone Bear struggled more than she did. He was a warrior with no battles to fight. A hunter with no land to hunt. A man who had built his identity on freedom and now lived in a cage. Some days he would sit outside the tipi for hours staring at nothing. Violet worried about him constantly. She tried to draw him back by reminding him of their children. Slowly he began to find small purposes. He started teaching the young boys to ride. 1 year into their time on the reservation, Dawn Star came to Violet with news. She had met a young man from another band. His name was Tall Pine, and he was gentle and kind, and she thought she might love him. Violet felt her heart squeeze. Her daughter was choosing to build a life here. She told Dawn Star she was happy for her. The wedding was small but joyful. The people needed something to celebrate. Stone Bear walked his daughter to her new husband with his head high and his eyes bright with unshed tears. Violet stood beside him and felt the bitter sweetness of watching their child become a woman. 2 years after arriving, Gray Feather died. On his last day, he called for Stone Bear and told him to lead what remained of their band. Stone Bear said he was not worthy. Gray Feather laughed and said that was exactly why he should do it. Stone Bear accepted the responsibility. Violet watched her husband grow into the role. He worked with the agents when he had to, but never let them bully him. He fought small battles over rations and land usage. He won some and lost others. But he kept fighting. As Violet approached her 40th year, she looked back on the girl she had been and marveled at the distance traveled. That girl had been so afraid. And here she was, still alive, surrounded by children and grandchildren. One evening she sat with Stone Bear watching the sunset. He looked older now, with gray threading his hair. She asked if he regretted their choices. He said regret was useless. They had done what they needed to survive, and their children were alive because of it. Violet nodded. Survival was not glorious, but it was everything. She and Stone Bear had chosen to exist, to endure. As darkness fell, Violet thought about the women who would come after her. She hoped they would remember where they came from. She hoped they would know they carried strength in their blood. She leaned against Stone Bear's shoulder. They had survived the worst, and they would keep surviving. Together.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.